Welcome, everyone. Please have a seat as you come in. You're at Measuring and Monetizing Ecosystem Services. We're thrilled to have a really full panel today. I see a lot of people still are going to come in. So my name's Nick Wobrock. I'm a partner at Blue Forest Conservation, and we are working to create an environmental impact bond in forestry, the Forest Resilience Bond. And a lot of the models and ideas related to capturing the value from improved forests, there's a lot of analogs from a lot of people on this panel and a lot of experiences from organizations related to water, carbon, as well as a lot of examples of innovative technologies in measurement and science. So today we have a diverse panel of backgrounds of people from the Forest Service, from academia and research, from remote sensing, from water quality trading markets, and from carbon. And I'm excited to introduce each of them, keep this as a conversation, and we'll make sure to reserve some time, 20 minutes hopefully, for questions at the end. And encourage any of you to approach us later with questions as well, as time permits. So with such a full panel, I want to make sure we can reserve time for everyone to explain how some of the solutions and challenges and opportunities that might exist. So thanks for coming. So with the first question we have, and first panelist, Amanda Cundiff, who works for the U.S. Forest Service, is here to share a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities facing the Forest Service, especially in the Southwest. To start out, what are some of the most pressing challenges you see for the Forest Service, as well as opportunities for collaboration?
Sure.
It should be live.
It's automatically on. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I want to start by wishing Woodsy Owl a happy 45th birthday today. Yeah, he's the lesser known of our mascots, but he has the appropriate tagline, lend a hand, care for the land, and that's appropriate today. Mm-hmm. So the Forest Service manages about 20 million acres here in California. This is our Pacific Southwest region. And to answer this particular question, three things came to mind for me. Ecological restoration, tree mortality, and of course climate change. So about 5 years ago, our regional leadership came together and decided to shift our focus entirely to a focus on ecological restoration. And what does that mean? It means of the 20 million acres that the Forest Service manages here in California, between 6 and 9 million acres are in need of some kind of treatment. So due to a century of fire suppression. So because we haven't had these regular natural fires come through these ecosystems that are fire adapted, they're overgrown. They have too many trees per acre. So just like if you picture your backyard, if you don't trim it back or cut any weeds for a year, you've got a lot of biomass there. Well, the same thing is happening in California's forests, except it's been a century, and a lot of biomass is on each acre. So that's basically the forest management challenge of the day as I see it. It's how to keep up with this rate the rate of biomass removal, thinning, and prescribed burning that we need to keep up with to keep the forests healthy. Now, that brings me to tree mortality. So we decided that was our main focus, and then last year, all of a sudden in 2015, the number of dead trees in California doubled. And as of May, the May aerial detection survey that was done here in California, there were 66 million dead trees in the Sierras, and the number has only gone up from there. So all of a sudden, we've had to focus our energies towards tree mortality, and we're basically in triage mode here. We're only focused on felling the trees that are imminently threatening people and infrastructure. And in the last year, we've cut about 105,000 dead trees. And that's meant reprioritizing our budget. So we've had to send, just in this region, $43 million that would have gone to ecological restoration projects, that would have gone to recreation, that would have gone to all the other things we do. We've had to reprioritize that and send it to felling dead trees. So the third thing, of course, is climate change. So climate change is exacerbating all these other stresses, the drought, the wildfires, the insect and disease outbreaks, and it's leading us to these landscapes now where they're unlike any in recorded history for us in the Sierras. We've had about over 4,600 wildfires in California just this year, and it's not looking any better.
And so what might some of the budget implications be as well in terms of to deal with this massive challenge of tree mortality, of restoration, of thinning, recognizing how expensive nationally, at least a lot of wildfires have been too. What does that do to the Forest Service budget, and what does that mean for being able to restore forests?
Right, so our budget has basically remained relatively flat over the last decade or so. It's a little over $5 billion, give or take. So we've got this budget, and then since 2000, we've had a longer fire season. It's cost more and more to fight these really extreme fires. So fire suppression used to be 16% of our budget 15 years ago, and last year, for the first time ever in our history, it surpassed half of our budget. So our overall budget, as you recall, is remaining flat. So all the other things that we do, the restoration, the stuff to get ahead of the forest fire problem, the recreation, environmental planning, all those things are losing out. They have to send money over to fire suppression. That's what it's doing.
Yeah, thank you very much. So water, carbon, habitat, quite a few very important services come from forests, especially in California, where we're largely arid as well. When we're not, where we're in the most of the state that receives a lot of the water benefits that come from these forests. Our next panelist, Martha Conklin, is professor of hydrology at UC Merced, works at the Sierra Nevada Research Institute. She's been doing quite a lot of research with colleagues as well on the implications and importance of forests in our ecosystem, and has a bit to present on that topic.
Thank you. Actually, I'm the professor in the group, so I have pictures, because I like them. So, as he mentioned, I'm from UC Merced. I don't use Macs, so that's mine.
It's okay.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So what I wanted to talk about, following the theme of the meeting, was monitoring and maintaining mountain ecosystem services. You've just heard some pretty sobering statistics from Amanda about in terms of how our trees are happening. So what I have here, but before I do any of that, since she brought up her mascot, I'm going to bring up UC Merced. We're the newest campus in the UC system, and we just got listed 78th best public university in the country by U.S. News and Report. That's pretty amazing for 10 years, so we're excited. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, here I have is some MODIS images of the Sierra Nevada. Now, I think of the Sierra Nevada as our water towers. They basically store water, about 60% of our consumptive use water, for 6 months a year, and as solid precipitation or snow. And here you can see the snowpack on 3 very different years. The one over on your left, is it? 2010 was the last really normal snow year that we had. That kind of fit that mean average snowpack that we've had over the last 50 years. What you're seeing in 2015 is the worst snowpack we had in quite a while. That was the 4th year of the drought. And then you see last year's snowpack. Okay, now let's think about this snowpack and how it gathers. And I want you to think about some questions. You know, first question is, how much snow do we have? You know, that's like a no-brainer. You guys deal with money. You know, you want to know water's money. You want to know how much we have. We don't really know how much snow we have. We take little point measurements, a lot of them, but around the Sierra Nevada. We have correlations that have built over the last 50 years, so no climate change, that say, okay, you have so much snow here April 1st, that's the amount of water we're going to have in our river. And those correlations work really well on average years. We don't have average snowpacks that often. They're not very good on extremely wet years or extremely dry years. So we really don't know. Now there's a bunch of people trying to answer that question, not some of the people at UC Merced as well, using advanced technology, remote sensing, setting LiDAR, basically looking at laser pulses going down, trying to measure the depth of the snow, trying to understand the topography. We're at UC Merced, we're actually want to put out ground-based sensors that capture some of the topographic variability. And the bottom line is, Snow tends to accumulate following patterns. So if you know the area of snow, and you start getting a sense of how it accumulates in different places with different slope, aspect, and elevation, we can actually get maybe within 30% of how much snow we have. But we're not even 30% right now. So we have, number one, an ecosystem service that's not well understood how much we have. And then, of course, since we don't know the starting point, then the question is what's the water yield? Because Amanda was talking about tree mortality, I'm also interested in how much water we get off the Sierra Nevada. That has a lot to do with our forests, because the single biggest water user in the whole state is what? The forests. Truly, they get to dip into the bucket first, and then it comes down. So we have not overgrown forests. We have overgrown forests, and the way the trees are spaced affect about how much snow accumulates, and it uses a lot of water. Ag a second, don't worry. And then the question is how resilient this ecosystem is. Well, we're beginning to see it's in real problems. So I'm going to just walk you through a couple things just to kind of put what Amanda put into figures. This is looking at the same place 100 years apart, two photographs. You see the upper one in 1890, that was not a logged landscape. That was the tree density about the 1890s. Now, it is an area that had regular fire move through it, so it was a natural fire regime. What you're seeing down below it is 1993, and that has about twice the biomass and about 6 times the number of stems. So let's think about that in terms of fire danger. You have a lot of small, skinny trees. They burn easier. They bring the fire up to the canopy of the big trees, and you start getting these catastrophic fires we have. So we have a system that not only is overgrown, it's not a fire-safe system anymore. So when we talk about treatments, it's really talking about how can we treat the landscape. Now we have a real problem because that wood isn't worth that much. Those small trees aren't worth that much. We have right now energy costs are at all-time lows. No one wants the wood for biomass. So it's a huge financial one. So I'd like to throw it out to you guys, or capitalists. What can we do with a system to make the product more useful? Because it's the water that gets affected.
Dead trees, too. We need a use for them.
Exactly. We definitely need them in terms of that. And then, I'm a hydrologist, so on the left, on your whichever, you see the pictures of all the fluxes I worry about. We've done a lot of sampling. We had a 7-year project where we looked at forest thinning. We said, okay, do we get water yield out of this if we improve the forest thinning? The answer was yes, we saw it. We did this with modeling and so on. But where we saw the biggest water yield was at the peak water flows. And it makes sense because what happens is, as I said, the trees are the biggest users. Our trees in the Sierra Nevada are exceptional trees. They have grown up in a system that does not rain in the summertime. They keep growing all winter long. They don't shut down, at least to about 8,000 feet. And so they're primed to use water when water's in the system. And so the time we can get the most, we thin trees in an area, the time you get the most water yield is when the days are shortest. Because once the days get longer, the trees, and we're having increasing temperatures, water use goes up for trees with increasing temperatures. So they start competing for the water. And if they're thin, they're actually healthier, and they use a little more water, so they grow faster. So it's just, so when we see it, but the problem with that release is the dams that we put, the rim dams, the ones that at the foothills of the Sierra, were put there for flood risk. And they were put there, and they have rules associated with it. Some of those rules require acts of Congress to change because they were put with federal dollars. And they are told that they have to let water run through to a certain date before they can start holding it up. So just think about, we have this, you start increasing water yield, it's coming when the maximum flows are coming, they're told they can't hold it up, so we lose it. So, there's a real societal questions too, and how, if we are gonna kind of adapt to the changes of the system. And of course, it's not that you just thin it once, it requires maintenance. And that would, whether it's controlled burns or natural fire reserve, but there's a lot to do with that. So I'd like to say, so with a lot of the stuff we do this, I think California's doing a great job. We're starting to get some type of planning set up, priority set up. But where societal investment comes in, so monetizing this, water has to be worth something. It produces hydropower, so you would like to optimize it, the water yield for hydropower. You would like to optimize the yield coming off the mountains. We don't want, that's a picture of the headwaters I show there is after the rim fire. You don't want one of these major fires go through. You don't get much snow accumulation on a landscape like that. Because if the trees aren't there to shade the snowpack, the snow melts faster. And we have longer and drier summers. So we can't go to, catastrophic fire is not the answer. And then the other thing I'd argue is that what we use when we run out of water in the mountains is we use our groundwater. And we have some legislation, eventually we're gonna have sustainable groundwater use. But if we're gonna start gathering more water off the mountains, we better think about maybe using it to replenish some of that system that's been depleted. So of course, these are societal investments, questions. It's going to take a bunch of really clever people to kind of pull together and face it. And, of course, we have water rights. And, traditionally, we gave the water rights out for beneficial use, and certainly agriculture has been the kind of the historical beneficial use that gets most of it. So we're just going to, so if we manage the forest to get more money, to get more water, then we have to think about who has that water, who has rights to it. And that's something that still needs to be addressed. But we don't want this. This is another part of our research we've looked at. This is about 4,000 feet. I put the elevation in there. It's in the Sierra National Forest. Those are all dead trees. We actually do a lot of work. We actually have towers up. We measure the respiration of trees at different elevations in a transect near there. The trees at 4,000 feet have about 1 year reserve of water. And once trees get stressed, they cannot fight off pests, because the way you get rid of bark beetles for a pine tree is you use sap to kind of push it out. It doesn't have, and in fact, a stressed tree might take 3 years to get to the point that it can fight this. So we've had these trees that were remarkably stressed. We're going to see the mortality move up in elevation because the trees at higher elevations were also stressed. They're not ready to come back and fight pests. We're getting warmer summers, warmer winters. You're seeing the pests move up. So we have a forest that's really at a crossroads. It provides a lot of services for us. I don't think California would be happy without its water. So I'll leave it with that. And here's a picture of a low snow year. You should not be able to walk in it.
Okay.
Sorry, a little long.
No, wonderful. Thank you, Martha, for helping set the stage both on a lot of the benefits that come from these forests, water-wise, but also the risks and the challenge from the hydrology perspective. That was great. And for the next three panelists really can help provide a lot of perspective on how ecosystem markets are developing, how they've worked in the past, how measurement has occurred, things to really build off the challenge and opportunity that we had our first two present. So for the next person, Robin Kraft from Planet Labs. Planet Labs, if you've ever seen their website, really nifty stuff. Shoebox-sized satellites. I'm excited to hear from Robin. Who is Planet Labs? What sort of projects do you have that, especially regarding to ecosystem services, carbon, water, environment, and what direction do you see it going?
So, thanks for having me today. I'm excited to talk with these folks. That was fascinating, hearing about the water in the forests. So Planet is a startup based here in San Francisco. We, like Nick said, we're building and operating small satellites. They're about the size of a loaf of bread or a cat or a small child. And we launch them by the dozen. We actually just kicked a few out of the back of the space station last night, which is pretty cool to watch, like from my bed, like on the laptop. So that's one of the perks of working at a place like this. You get to see cool stuff in space. But the reason that we build and launch these satellites, which is really expensive, although part of the cool thing about Planet is that it's much less expensive than in other places, is that we really want to be able to measure and understand what's happening with life on Earth. So the way this works is we're launching, we'll have over 100 satellites by the end of the year. We're around 50 now, 50 or 60, it sort of depends. when you ask which ones are operational and which ones are actually deployed at any given moment. But we're going to have over 100 by the end of the year, and we'll be imaging the whole world every day in visible bands as well as near infrared. And for the forestry and ag folks around here, near infrared is obviously a killer thing to measure, because it tells you a lot about, first of all, where vegetation is, as well as how healthy it is. So we're going to be imaging the whole world every day at 3 to 5 meter resolution, depending on orbits, and that means that we can sort of see cars, we can see trucks, we can't see people, but we can see amazing things happening in landscapes. So I was just in our chat room today. I saw a fascinating series of images of sugarcane deforestation happening somewhere in Peru or Bolivia, I don't remember where. And just over the course of a couple weeks, you see this thing growing over time. And that's the kind of thing that you can see with MODIS data, which is much coarser, but I've used MODIS a lot and I love this stuff, so don't get me wrong. But what's really great about what we're seeing in our imagery is that you get the detail that's better than Landsat, and very frequent updates, so you can really see the trajectory of where landscape change is going. So in the case of deforestation, you can see the spread of sort of like a viral spread across the landscape. That's really interesting to see, but also important to be able to quantify. And in terms of this whole thing, the important thing is that we can observe a fair number of ecosystem services from space, in principle at least. And having that ability to persistently monitor the forest or riparian, what's the word? Riparian vegetation, or what have you, on a regular basis, just without having to call someone and say, hey, can we get this image? Or without having to take out your jeweler's loop and look at Landsat imagery. To get like detail and frequent updates will be really important for having strong financial instruments that are able to really monetize ecosystem services in a way that make them better used and more sustainably used. So in terms of projects that we have going on right now, the one that I know of specifically around ecosystem services is that we're working with the Carnegie Airborne Institute using they fly an airborne platform for doing super high resolution imaging of forests around the state, but they can't fly the entire state. It's just prohibitively expensive, and if you wanted to fly it twice, that's doubly prohibitively expensive. So what we think is a really interesting way to operate with the capability we're providing is you take something like the Carnegie Institute's work, and basically scale it up using different modeling techniques, so that you can sample different parts of the forest, and then for areas that you're not sampling, you can use planet imagery to model the ecosystem services that were detected in the smaller sample areas. So that way, for much lower cost than flying a plane over every inch of California, you'd be able to get a much better picture of ecosystem services that we can detect from space than we have today.
Thank you. Yeah, higher resolution, higher frequency every hour compared to sometimes every 2 weeks, which is
Every day.
Well, every day. Maybe eventually every hour, but some pretty neat, innovative stuff coming on in San Francisco here. So encourage you to check them out if you get a chance, and think about ways there's an Open California platform that you're part of that people can use, see data, see opportunities. If you can find ways to measure things, actually give a plug for that.
Yeah, we have a program called Open California where we make all of our California data open for free. So you can go through there's some kind of delay, maybe a couple of weeks, but then you have our archive going back in time, back I believe as far as 2013. And we also own the Rapid Eye constellation, so if you've ever used that, we have their data as well. So it's a pretty sweet data set. You just have to sign up online, and we'll hope that you'll need it in other places and that you'll make us a profit-making company, but we're happy to help out in California. We also have, for academics, we also make data available through our ambassador program. So if you have some interesting research that you want to do or a pilot program, definitely get in touch through our website.
Great, thank you, Robin. So as we put our thinking caps together on how can we try and fund and restore the forests, or at least mitigate some of the massive threat of that tree mortality, our risk to water resources in California, wildfires, and the costs associated with them. Wanted to bring two more people on the panel that really have a lot of experience in developing other types of ecosystem markets, where the next panelist, Alex Johnson, who works with the Freshwater Trust, has really been pioneering water quality trading and learning about some of the hurdles that have been along that way, and who is the Freshwater Trust could be a good point of inspiration and also an analog in some ways for dealing with forest health. So.
Great. Thanks, Nick, for the invitation. Great to be here. I'm down from Portland, Oregon. The Freshwater Trust is a 501c3 river restoration nonprofit. We've been around for 33 years. We're headquartered up there in Portland. And we now have offices, 3 or 4 offices out in outskirts of Oregon. Ashland is our biggest one outside of Portland, as well as an office in Boise and now in Sacramento. So we've been growing a little bit over the last couple of years as we find kind of new places to apply some of the innovative financial mechanisms that we've been developing. So we are a river restoration nonprofit. We originally were doing advocacy, back in the 80s, listing wild salmon, et cetera. Really got into large-scale log jams, remeanders, streamside vegetation projects, and about 8 or 9 years ago, started trying to figure out what other ways beyond the traditional nonprofit ways could we fund those types of actions, the actions that really have huge benefits for water quality and water quantity. So as it turns out, I kind of lucked into a position where I get to be at the forefront of that. My background's economics and market logistics. I was working in commodity trading right out of school, and caught a flyer with the Freshwater Trust 6 years ago and learned very quickly about how to apply ecosystem services principles before I even knew really what those were to this newly developing thing in Oregon, which is called water quality trading. Water quality trading is only one thing, one mechanism by which the Freshwater Trust funds our restoration and watershed conservation efforts. We also do a lot of in-stream water transactions. We do a lot of grant-funded work. We're kind of diverse in that way. But it is one of the ones that's growing quite quickly. When I joined, we were about 20 staff, and we're now 45. And so a lot of that has been staff around applied environmental markets and specifically water quality trading. So water quality trading is, for those that don't know, is based on the Clean Water Act, putting a cap or an allocation on dischargers, primarily dischargers that put water of some quality into the rivers and waters of the U.S. For the 40 years, it's been doing a pretty good job, actually. It's been good legislation, good regulation. And so those entities that discharge water into the waters of the U.S., generally their water quality is no longer the driving issue in those watersheds. The Clean Water Act is far less prescriptive on what are called non-point sources. So if you think of a discharger as being a point of discharge, everybody that doesn't have a pipe but impacts a water body is a non-point source. And so one of the bigger non-point sources as a sector is agriculture. Agriculture, in terms of its impacts on water quality and quantity, has not been very well regulated over the last 40 years. That leads to the ability for a business case to be made by somebody like myself that if a discharger needs to reduce their temperature input, and they already have reduced 95% of their temperature input, but they are the only ones getting a regulatory hammer, and it's a $16 million bill that they're looking at to build a cooling tower, even though they are less than 1% of the total temperature issue in a watershed. If they don't have any alternatives, they're just going to go build that thing to get Clean Water Act compliance. We have developed and are part of a sector that is developing alternative compliance solutions. In the case of temperature, we quantify the temperature benefits of streamside riparian shade. We find the places where that shade does not exist in the watershed. We contract with the local landowner. We go in and revegetate. We quantify the temperature benefits of that shade 20 years from now because we have an underlying contract with the landowner to monitor and maintain that site for 20 years to fairly robust quality standards with third-party verification and all sorts of certification.
Why is temperature important?
So temperature is important in Oregon. Yeah, I guess I'm in California. In Oregon, temperature is very vitally important to keep our salmon fisheries going. So we need cool water in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho because otherwise the salmon cannot reproduce. So even Northern California, we're working on temperature. So we build alternatives like that. We've been able to do that fairly successfully over the last 5 or 6 years. We have about $10 million in contracts right now for temperature credits in Oregon. We're continuing to develop those in Idaho as well, and as you know, California over the last couple years. And phosphorus is actually a bigger driver in Idaho and California. And when you look east, phosphorus and nitrogen is a huge water quality driver. So we're putting our shoulder to the wheel. There's a lot of folks working on this, but to try to figure out how do you quantify the phosphorus benefits of working with agriculture to change their practices, and then how do you actually make that happen, you know? And that's what I think the Freshwater Trust has been able to do, is go in as an aggregator. We will hold private contracts with private landowners. We will pay them to change their practices, and then we will transact that credit over to a regulated entity, which I know is a mouthful. Hopefully I'll get another question or two to explain that, or you can catch me after. But it's a place, you know, it's not the only tool, but it is a tool that we as a conservation entity feel like is sorely needed in a lot of places. It's regulatory flexibility that's really needed, because otherwise we are going to spend a heck of a lot of money to build more and more gray infrastructure with much less water quality benefit. And so we need to be able to innovate to really get out into the landscape where there's much more bang for your buck by doing natural infrastructure. So we're doing a lot of that.
And although you're visiting from Portland, you were down here for other work as well. And
Yeah.
TFTs in California.
We've been working in Sonoma County with the city of Santa Rosa for a couple of years now on their phosphorus issues. We're working in Las Virgenes in the Malibu area. We have, as I said, a Sacramento area, our office. Sustainable Groundwater Management Act has caught our attention. We do a lot of water quantity transactions in Oregon, and so we have a toolkit that we feel like could help some of these newly developing groundwater management agencies develop their plans and figure out how and where to tweak their usage. So there's a whole heck of a lot of interesting things here in California that we're hoping to be a part of and already have started. So
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. And last but not least, I want to introduce Ricardo Bayonne, a partner at Encourage Capital. He's also a mentor to Blue Forest Conservation, where I work at developing that forest resilience bond. Ricardo has deep expertise in carbon markets, lots of experience with transactions, and also what creates a market that's viable to support and value ecosystem services. So, Ricardo, who's Encourage Capital, and can you share some of your perspective and stories over the years of
Sure.
success stories?
Sure. So Encourage Capital is an impact investment firm. We're based in New York, and our vision is to try and create investment opportunities that help address some of the world's most fundamental problems. And the way we work, that I think is somewhat different from many other impact investment firms, is that we start from the impact. We start from the problem. We ask ourselves, what is the big issue you're trying to address? What are the problems that lead to that issue? And where could private capital play a fundamental, transformative role in changing that problem? So we work with experts to analyze a particular issue. We've done work on fisheries, we've done work on carbon, we've done work on water in the western United States, we've done some work on forestry. Most recently, we've begun working on agriculture ranching and the interconnection between agriculture ranching and water, because I think obviously the way we grow our food is one of the biggest drivers of just about every environmental and social problem you care to name. So how do we do that is going to be a fundamental transformation for the future. But talking about ecosystem services and about carbon and about how we solve these problems, I just want to reflect that if you listen to all these presentations, you get an image as an investor or somebody who works with companies of the Earth as a very badly run company. Why? Because it's as if we were running a machine that made us money and kept us in business, but we decided, hell, we're not going to pay for operation and maintenance of that machine. Forget O&M expenditures. We don't need that. And we're going to hope that this machine is going to keep running the way it's been running for the last several million years. Well, no, it's not going to work that way. Things fall apart, things change. You gotta spend money in order to keep that thing alive. Or thinking about space and your image of these satellites coming off of a spaceship, it really is even worse than that, because it's as if we were on a spaceship and we decided not to pay for the operation and maintenance of our life support systems, because hell, who needs life support anyway, right? And we were also beginning to take that life support system apart for parts, to do other stuff, to build widgets, right? It makes utterly no sense when you think about it that way, and yet that's exactly what we're doing with ecosystem services, because as people who come to SOCAP know that at a fundamental level, our economic system, our capital system, it's an incredibly powerful tool, no doubt about it. Probably I would argue, one of the most powerful tools humans have ever created is our financial system and our economic system. But it is not flawless. It has some huge blind spots. Those blind spots are often around social and environmental issues, and here we see a very big blind spot. Why? Because our economic system was created hundreds and hundreds of years ago at a time when what was scarce was capital and labor, and that's what we value. Natural resources, not so scarce. They were the problem. We got to get rid of that swamp. We got to get rid of that forest. We got to get rid of those wild animals, right? And so nobody could imagine a time when there weren't as many cod in the Atlantic banks, or buffalo on the Great Plains, or passenger pigeons. It's like no way humans would ever have a dent on that kind of biological productivity. Well, guess what? We've had a dent on all those types of biological productivity, right? And I guess the other analogy I would make is, imagine if you were running Windows 95 on your computer now, right? With Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all the crap like that. You would be living with a blue screen of death, right? Well, we're running our economic system not on Windows 1995. We're running it on maybe, call it 1695, right? With all of these blind spots out there. So how do we change that? And where do markets play a role? Well, we've got to correct that blind spot. We've got to find ways to pay for the operations and maintenance of the forest, to understand even what's in our inventory, if you use the analogy of a business, right? And that's where the measuring and monitoring comes in. Imagine a business that has no idea what it owns, has no idea what assets it has. Makes no sense whatsoever, and yet that's what we live with every day in this market. Now, I've had a lot of experience with carbon markets, which are a patch of this blind spot. They're attempts to put a value on that particular ecosystem services in much the same way that the water quality and quantity markets are attempts to fix and correct that blind spot. I actually think we're going to have a rethink of our economic system at more fundamental levels, but these things are great because they begin to bring the value in. And the way the carbon markets were created is much the same way that the water markets were created, right? You needed a regulator, you needed a government to say, thou shalt not emit carbon. And that created a cap, and then you allocated the right to emit under that cap, and then people traded. And once people started trading, they'll say, I'll give you X for that. All of a sudden, carbon has a value. And if you're an emitter, and you have to ask yourself, should I emit 10 tons of carbon? Well, how much is it worth? If I save it, can I make money? Yes, in this system. If I emit it, does it cost me money? Yes, in this system. So it brings that blind spot, it brings that value into the bottom line analysis of a company. And that's what we're trying to do with these ecosystem service markets. So, one misconception is that these are all private markets. No, they require that act of regulation, whether it's the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, at least in that form. There are ecosystem services that people are willing to pay for without legislation, but as a friend of mine says, nobody wakes up in the morning wanting a bowl of carbon. If you're talking about coffee, if you're talking about other things like that, okay, you can get people to pay for that. But how do we deal with these services that are essentially, pretty much public goods for the economists out in the room, right? They are goods that you cannot exclude people from, whether it's clean air or clean water. How do you add value to these? How do we bring that value into the economic system? We've seen in the carbon markets and in water markets that when you bring that value, when you start to be able to bring that value, you start to raise money that is able to be used for the operations and maintenance of our life support systems, whether it's the forests or the water systems or many other systems that we don't pay attention to because we've never had to pay for it. So I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Ricardo. So the need for regulation at times for that level playing field or to identify what can be traded and how to measure what can be traded is very important. The need for collaboration is also really critical. Amanda, one question I had as well was the National Forest System, a lot of it, there's the World Office in Washington, D.C., but forests are in our backyards. National forests can be in our local watersheds. How can groups or people seek to collaborate with the Forest Service? What sort of tools may exist?
That's a great question. So we've actually been really changing our operating model over the last, 5 to 10 years, and it's happened kind of almost without us noticing it. There are these collaborative groups that are just popping up all over the West around forest communities, and the Forest Service is getting more involved in participating in those groups. So it's everything from attending monthly meetings with stakeholders, everybody from like the agricultural community to recreation users of every stripe, but also going out on field tours so that the Forest Service employees and those stakeholders understand the problem in the same way and can have productive discussions about that. So that's something that we really weren't doing, I would say, as much 10 or 15 years ago. And now there's so many of them. I can think of probably 10 in California that are attached to certain places and forests. The closest national forest to here is about 2.5 hours away, but still, the water is coming from the Sierras here. And in the East Bay, you've got the water that East Bay Mud is providing is coming direct, 90% of it is from Stanislaus and the El Dorado National Forest. So we're doing some more thinking about how to engage the urban populations where those ecosystem services are benefiting the public and how to engage both corporations and the public through the water utilities right here.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for those answers and questions and thoughts about ecosystem services, the opportunity in the future, some of the technology and research going on. Now would be a great opportunity to hear of questions from the audience as well. If you have any burning questions that came up from any of the discussion that's gone on, we welcome that. We can have, so we can, I might take mine down. We have enough. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Ben. And we can pass this off. There's some questions over there. Thanks, Ben. Sounds great. Okay, thanks.
Great. Hi, thank you very much. I actually work on similar problems in social services, and I'm very interested in the application. And one of the things I do is build outcome valuation models of outcomes and improved outcomes, particularly for at-risk populations. So, and there, you can certainly look at it. You can have an analytical model, which really looks at the value, or where does the market clear, right? And so I'm kind of curious. Do you have analytical models? And by the way, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of how we have to rethink our economic system for both those reasons, and really glad to hear you say that. But so are there analytical models in terms of valuing ecosystem services, or are you thinking about it more on a market basis? What is somebody willing to pay for carbon, for instance?
Yeah, there are obviously a ton of analytical models on what are the values of ecosystem services, and there's been some pretty seminal papers, Bob Costanza and others who have done this analysis, and the answer is it's worth trillions and trillions of dollars, more than the entire economic system put together. And I think that is a very important tool in raising awareness of, hey, here's something that's really valuable that we're just not taking into account. But I think where rubber hits the road in terms of raising money to pay for the O&M of these services, as well as changing the way day-to-day activities happen around these services, it's these markets that have really begun to have an impact. And the reason for that is because all of a sudden, people have to pay to keep water temperatures down. People have to pay to emit carbon. So it's starting to come into the bottom lines. And then analysts can go in and say, well, how much unit of economic value are you producing per emissions of carbon? Because what gets paid for gets measured. All of a sudden, if you are paying for every ton of carbon you're emitting, you got a very big interest to make sure you know exactly what you're emitting and the government's not charging you more than you should be. So you're starting to measure, you're starting to value measurement, you're starting to pay for measurement, and all of that, I think, has a fundamental change. I think the analytical models are the beginning, are the nudge we need to get things moving, but at the end of the day, it's those market values that actually enter into the economic system that are worthwhile, because we don't set the price of a cup of coffee by asking economists what it's worth. We set it by actually getting people to say, what are you willing to pay for it? Because if you ask people, what are you willing to pay for it, that's also one thing. They can tell you, yeah, I'll pay you $100. But when you say, pull out a checkbook, pay me $100 now, they'll go, oh yeah, in that case, maybe $5, right? You know, that's where it really starts to see the value. And I think the problem is we don't see that value.
Thank you. See some.
Hi, thanks a lot for the panel, very insightful. So I am a landscape regeneration practitioner, so I really loved hearing about some of the things happening up in the Northwest. And my question, I'm going to meander just a bit because it's just at the edge of my ability to articulate, I think, but it has to do with where the tipping point is between our attention and investment into metrics-driven and analytical-driven understandings of how we're valuating ecosystem services and the amount of investment that we could be getting working in a landscape. I think a lot of from my perspective, many of the next steps to take care of the hydrology system of California, for instance, are actually pretty clear. So what happens if that money gets moving to actually start getting to work? And where's the balance there? And I think maybe having a couple panelists speak to that. Where's the balance between getting on with it and getting on towards regeneration of landscapes versus investing in metrics? I know it's not a either or, but what's the appropriate balance?
Yeah, I think I'm getting it, and it certainly, my organization is inherently impatient and has seen a lot of financial resources in the last couple decades that could and probably should be spent on water quality and fish habitat spent in courtrooms. And we employ lawyers. We like lawyers generally. They've done some great things. But we'd much rather spend our limited water resource dollars in stream as much as we possibly can. And so we generally are kind of, from a broad view, pretty smash and grab. We use publicly available models by and large. We take whatever data is available in a specific watershed. We get stakeholders around and we say, look, if no data set is perfect, no model is perfect, let's make some assumptions. Let's add a trading ratio because everybody around the table knows usually that there is a huge benefit to riparian revegetation or conservation tillage or upgrading irrigation practices to drip, and to not only to water quality and water quantity, but to biodiversity and carbon and da-da-da-da-da. So everybody knows that. We usually don't even have to convince anybody of that, but the metrics generally don't exist and the data are not available to give the assurance that if they spend those dollars that they will be remunerated with compliance. So we've had a fair bit of success at just saying, look, we've got enough. We don't need any more lawyers. We can gather more data as we go. We can use these models that are kind of funky and go. If only we can. Usually, this is the hitch, and this is how you do it. If you can get the regulatory agencies to provide some level of assurance to the public entities, and that's the hard part. In my opinion, it's a challenging thing, especially because we generally, as a society, do not fund regulators very well. And so most every regulator I know is very well-meaning. They are very bright. They are very passionate, but they're usually doing 3 or 4 people's jobs. They are not paid to innovate. They're paid to check a box. And so that is unfortunate. Generally, we have to bake the whole thing and lead the regulator to it and then go a little bit political and put some pressure on, their higher-ups and their higher-ups and the legislature to say, this makes so much sense, we got to go. Because at the end of the day, what we would like that regulator, in this case a permit writer, for example, to be able to do is say, you can use, instead of building a cooling tower or a tertiary filtration system that takes out 0.0001% of the total phosphorus load in this watershed, you are allowed to use an alternative compliance mechanism to go out in the landscape and change agricultural practices en masse. Right? You are allowed to do that. If you hold to these quality standards and you monitor and maintain to these standards, we will allow you to do that. It's really challenging, though. But we spend a lot of time on that. And I would say, we as a sector, we need more resources from the impact investment community, from the government, from anywhere where we can get it. Because from a historical perspective, there was a lot of money put into building railroads before there was commodities trading, right? Before there was a bushel of wheat and a regulator and, a pork belly and all those things. A lot of people put a lot of private money into there. We're kind of in the same place with these environmental credits where there's a lot of time and money need to get spent with who knows how much return, but it needs to happen, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's going to pay somebody off at some point soon-ish if that money gets put in. But it's just hard to get enough money and put in enough time to make it real.
That's not a great investment pitch. You
No, I
realize.
know, but it's sad, but it's true. It's like it's what needs to happen.
I agree with you 100%, but it's a tough investment.
Oh, totally.
And creating tools for replication so that first transaction, fifth transaction, might be harder than the 20th, the 100th, the scale that you want to.
But it gives us, we are not waiting anywhere for perfect. We generally are being a little bit more, being a lot less risk averse than we may be doing in other places, because we need to put stuff on the ground.
Absolutely.
We can't wait around.
Great. Let's take another question too, so we can get a few more. Ben, you are the arbiter. Thank you.
Hi. I was just wondering, so what kind of trends are you guys seeing in capital flows to impact investing funds? And, I guess, what can we do to, grow the space, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, we participated in a report that was done 2 years ago on impact investing and conservation, because we knew that there were people out there like GIN, the Global Impact Investment Network, and others who were measuring impact investment generally, but that measurement was mostly on the social side, very little on the conservation side. So we did a project with the Nature Conservancy, with the Packard Foundation, the Moore Foundation, and JP Morgan to try and analyze what type of investment was going into conservation from impact investors. What we found was that from the private sector side, we did a survey. It was a pretty exhaustive survey. It was by no means perfect. There were a lot of holes. So this is just an indication. We know that there's probably more that we didn't capture, but the point was that there was about $2 billion going into impact investment and conservation the way we defined it. Interestingly, a lot of it, basically also as an artifact of the way the survey was done, that it was largely in the US with some input from Europe, but not nearly enough. In the US was going to forest companies who were buying land and who were doing sustainable forestry type activities that they argued had a conservation value, and I would argue some of them probably do. That was the vast majority of it. Another interesting finding from that report, and that report is public and you can look at it, and in fact, we're working with the same actors to do a follow-up report this year, which should be coming out in the next few months, so we'll see how it's changed. But one of the interesting things was that there was more money than deals. So there were impact investors who said, we have money to put into these deals, we can't find the deals. Why can't we find the deals? Because this is not a grant, this is an investment. And the deals out there aren't convincing us that there's a return on investment, so we can't invest in it, right? Or they don't have experienced managers or track record. But guess what? This field's so new, of course there's no track record. We do need some risk capital to come in to do some of the new things. And, like, take, for instance, the great work that Nick and his partners are doing at Blue Forest to try to create a pilot fund for forest restoration. Something completely different, right? It's taking the social impact bond model, applying it to conservation. Totally new. What's the track record? Nobody's done that. How could we possibly tell you what the track record is? But we need some brave souls to finance that work in order to make it happen, because it will address one of the fundamental problems that the Forest Service has, which is it's in a vicious circle. And I'd hate to be in your shoes because it's difficult, right? You're spending money to fight fires and taking money away from preventing fires to fight fires. So guess what? Next year, more fires. So we do it again and again and again. Well, what we're trying to do with this fund is reverse that by what? Borrowing from future firefighting to pay for the protection of forests or the prevention of fires today. This is we do this all the time in financial markets. Why not apply it to an issue like this? So we need brave souls to do that, but there isn't nearly enough money coming in. But even the money that's there is not finding the deals. So we need more investors with an eye for investment that are able to create deals that promise a return on investment and can pitch it to investors. And we need risk capital to go into sectors that are new, where we'll only have pilots, we won't have track record, we won't have experienced management teams. All of the box you check as an investor will not be there. So who are the brave souls that can do that? And that's part of what we need.
Thank you, Ricardo. More questions? How about in the back there?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in using market mechanisms to address a lot of the environmental problems that we have today, especially if we're operating in the confines of our current economic system. But from what I've seen, there's only a limited number of markets that have developed so far, focusing on things like fishery, forestry, water, carbon. But there are numerous other ecosystem services out there that there are no markets for yet. And it sounds like the primary reason for that is there isn't the proper regulation in place yet for a market to develop. Because with all of these other markets we've seen, some sort of regulation might have been the initiating factor. So my question is, are there initiatives out there to try to, starting from like the actual value of the service, figure out how do you create policies that will then enable a market to form for those services so that we can assign a value to them?
That's great. And I have a quick first answer and then welcome the rest. But a lot of the ecosystem services that you targeted, I've heard in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, there's so much money invested in salmon and salmon protection. And that's totally true. The nice aspect of salmon is that there's a lot of co-benefits. When you have salmon, when you have cold water, when you have, then there's likely, if it's a healthy stream, there's insects, there's biodiversity, there's other co-benefits that can come. And so identifying a few of these main targets, at least to start out with, that have more certainty, and are boiled down from some of the complexity that really is truly hard to measure for some of the ecosystem services we also depend on, is one first avenue towards developing that market. Any other thoughts from the panel here?
Well, I just want to say is that after the Rim fire, San Francisco Public Utility District tried to value the ecosystem services they had. They couldn't value all of it. I mean, their report, there's about half of them, they could come up values for them. And then once they did the report and they showed, and I forgot how much it was worth, they were asked, well, could they use it as a basis for getting the ratepayers to pay for maintenance of their watershed? I mean, they dodged a huge bullet. If that fire had come closer to the reservoir, they wouldn't have been able to deliver water to San Francisco anymore because they don't clean it. And they said no. They couldn't ask the ratepayers to do that. So there is, so we have, it's an interesting question because we don't know fully how to value them. And then we have to have the will from the people to get benefits from them to help support it. So
it's a great example.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a little bit of voluntary market activity that does not need a regulation to go. I think source water protection is probably a big one that, there's been some money changing hands for source water. Denver has spent quite a bit of money. There should be a heck of a lot more. That's the crazy part about what's happening in the Sierra Nevadas is it's like, it's like seeing Pearl Harbor coming a couple of years from now and being like, well, nobody, none of our departments can figure out how to get the money to make a phone call to let everybody know. It's just like California has the budget, but they can't figure out how to point it at the right things. Anyway, source water, I think, is a place that you could get voluntary going. The dreaded sustainability word, I think agricultural supply chain, as there are more resiliency issues, and as watersheds, just dry up and do not produce anymore, I think all of a sudden sustainability will be less about branding and more about actually making sure that you can grow productive food crops in some of these watersheds for 60, 100 more years, and there's going to be a lot more insight there. But yeah, I mean, to your question, it's a really difficult one. You need science. Science costs money. Science takes time, and for parameters that are outside of the scope of what we've mostly been talking about, there just isn't a real driver to do that. Although a biodiversity butterfly credit would be really important.
And you hope for a lot of co-benefits too.
Yeah, it's been demonstrated. There's been demonstration and pilot projects up the wazoo on all of these types of things, but putting it into practice has been a huge issue and probably will continue to be so.
Yeah, and it's not just, markets are one tool, and they're a tool that works well in some situations, but we got to be careful of that adage of to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There are problems that will not be solved by the creation of these markets. There are other problems that we are beginning to see values attached to ecosystem services in different ways that do not involve markets. So, there's also that old adage of the time to fix the roof is when it's raining, is not when it's raining, it's when it's dry. Well, sometimes you don't know you need to fix the roof until it rains and you get water dripping on your head, right? So take the issue of stormwater management of cities. Cities are dealing with, basements being flooded with sewage. All of a sudden, they're more amenable to paying money to deal with the issue of stormwater management, and if they can do it with green infrastructure, cheaper and better and faster than with gray infrastructure or with a combination of green and gray infrastructure, I think they're starting to be open to it. Not exactly a market, although DC has created a market for stormwater credit trading that we are participating in. So it doesn't have to be a market, I guess, is my point. There are other ways these values come into the economic system, and we have to understand all those different ways.
That's a fantastic conclusion. Really want to thank the panel for being here today, and thank all of you for coming as well.